In 1946, Peggy Guggenheim published Out of This Century, a wry and revealing account of her life so far. She was 48 years old. In New York, her avant-garde museum gallery, Art of This Century, was a critical and popular success. Opened in October 1942, the innovatively designed exhibition space on West 57th Street had become a gathering place for the most important artists then working in New York, a showcase for exiled European émigrés and talented young American painters. One of Peggy's assistants, Marius Bewley, noted who came to the gallery, how often, and for how long. Breton, around a great deal, Tanguy, often, Fernand Léger, Ossip Zadkine, and Marc Chagall. Mata, Pavel Chalichev, was there a lot, Duchamp, frequently, Man Ray, once or twice, Barr, frequently, Kiesler, Alexander Calder, all the time, James Johnson Sweeney, would stay all day, Motherwell, Jean-Paul Sartre, Pollock, Gypsy Rose Lee, David Hare, Clifford Still, Herbert Reed, spent a lot of time, Mary McCarthy, occasionally, and so on. Art of This Century, itself an example of what would later be called installation art, remained a cultural force in New York and the wider world from 1942 until 1947. At the gallery, viewers could study masterpieces such as Brancusi's Bird in Space, works that might possibly have survived without Peggy's intervention, but which she had rescued, along with many examples of what the Nazis termed degenerate art, from Europe on the brink of World War II. At Peggy's gallery, one could contemplate the work of the Surrealists in a setting that was livelier and more exciting than any existing museum or exhibition space. Peggy was neither the first nor the only person to introduce Surrealism to the United States. There had already been shows at the Museum of Modern Art and at private galleries, but she was very good at making sure that it was talked about by critics and seen by younger artists. She encouraged and showed the work of a new generation of Americans, and it is partly thanks to Peggy that American artists shook off the influence of Europe. One can only speculate about how different the history of modern art would have been had Peggy not commissioned Jackson Pollock to paint a mural for the hallway of her East Side apartment, a work that helped change the ways in which Pollock and his peers thought about painting. By 1944, when Peggy's friend, the art critic Clement Greenberg, began urging her to write her memoir, the gallery no longer required her constant presence, as it had at the start. Her marriage to Max Ernst had ended the previous year when he'd left her for the painter Dorothea Tanning. Peggy was living in a brownstone on East 61st Street with a wealthy British art collector, Kenneth Macpherson, a homosexual with whom she was having a complicated and disappointing love affair. Her penchant for brief, casual, erotic entanglements had taken on a frenetic edge, and she had reason to be concerned about her daughter Peggy, whose unhappiness and instability were becoming increasingly obvious, and who had gotten into trouble in Mexico, from which she had had to be rescued by her father. Peggy was also disturbed and depressed by the war, and by the news from Europe, where she had spent much of her adult life, and which, as an American Jew in Nazi-occupied France, she had been forced to leave. Encouraged by Greenberg, who had interested Dial Press in Peggy's book, and by her first husband, Lawrence Vail, who was himself a writer and who agreed to help edit the manuscript, Peggy began serious work on the project while staying at the Cherry Grove Hotel on Fire Island in the summer of 1944. The literary critic Marius Bewley, who worked as Peggy's receptionist and assistant at Art of This Century, recalls her writing propped up in bed, 3 sentences to a page. When she returned from vacation, she brought to the gallery every morning notepaper on which she'd written in green ink the previous night. Peggy wrote to Lawrence Vail, saying that her work on the memoir not only allowed her to forget the war, but that it was currently more interesting than the gallery, which had become a bore. She promised, or threatened, to write a book so honest that Lawrence would never forgive her, and she added, "I've written 3,400 words since 11 today." In a letter to her friend, the diarist and novelist Emily Coleman, who, on the strength of Peggy's journals, had long considered her to be a gifted writer, Peggy reported that she lived and breathed for her book. Interviewed in Time magazine after her memoir was published,